You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Jack Smith says he's ready to hit Trump with new trial when his term ends, based on an article by Adam Lynch. Immunity, obstruction, and the lie of delay. The story in one sentence. Jack Smith says the evidence against Donald Trump remains intact, and that the legal case survived the Supreme Court's immunity ruling in a narrowed form. The point of this interview is not that justice failed to notice Trump's conduct. The point is that institutions with real power kept creating new ways to slow, shrink, and politically smother accountability. Power sat with the defendants, not the prosecutor. The article's framing flatters the idea that a special counsel and a cable interview still matter more than the machinery around Trump. They do not. The actual power sat with Trump, the Supreme Court, and then Trump's allies inside the Justice Department after his return to office in 2025. Smith could preserve evidence. He could adjust theory. He could insist the record was still usable. He could not control the institutions that kept moving to protect the man at the center of the case. That is the real political fact here. Accountability did not fail because the evidence disappeared. It failed because power moved to protect itself. Trump's defense was never innocence. Trump and his allies called the investigation political persecution. That language was never a rebuttal to the facts. It was a shield against them. It was a way to recast documented conduct as grievance, and to make prosecutors look like the aggressors. The article repeats the familiar script without lingering on what it means. Deliberate abuse gets translated into a partisan weather event, and obstruction becomes just another opinion. Smith's response matters because it cuts through that smoke. He did not say the case was symbolic. He said he would not have gone forward unless he believed he could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That is not theater. It is the bare minimum standard a democratic legal system is supposed to defend. Trump's side tried to turn that standard into a political attack. The court helped narrow the damage. The Supreme Court's immunity ruling did not settle the substance of Trump's conduct. It changed the legal terrain in a way that favored delay, carve-outs, and selective exposure. Smith says prosecutors then had to sort evidence into usable and unusable buckets because the court had insulated part of the conduct. That is not neutrality. That is a high court making it harder to hold a president to account after the fact. This is where the article's language stays too polite about power. Complex legal questions is a genteel phrase for a system that kept inventing procedural cover for a man who attacked the democratic transfer of power and hoarded classified material. The complexity was not accidental. Complexity is one of the oldest tools institutions use when they want to appear lawful while making consequences harder to reach. Institutional cowardice has a personnel list. The most revealing line in the source is not about the evidence. It is about Trump's return to office in 2025 and the allies he placed in key Justice Department positions. That is the mechanism. Authoritarian politics do not rely on one dramatic coup. They rely on staffing. They rely on loyalists in the offices that are supposed to enforce the law. They rely on turning prosecution into an administrative inconvenience. That is why this story should not be read as a narrow legal drama. It is a case study in capture. The same political network that triggered the investigation later gained leverage over the institution charged with pursuing it. Once that happened, the question was never whether the facts existed. The question was whether the state would be allowed to act on them. What this really proves. Smith's confidence that the case can resume later is important, but it should not be romanticized. A file waiting on a shelf is not accountability. Preserved evidence is not justice. And a future prosecution, if it ever comes, will not erase the message already sent. When a president assembles enough institutional power, the system will spend years explaining why the rules are suddenly hard to apply. That is the deeper pattern. Trump did not merely evade one prosecutor. He showed how easily democratic institutions can be bent into hesitation when the target controls enough appointments, enough propaganda, and enough legal insulation. The lesson is not that the system worked slowly. The lesson is that it worked exactly as designed for people with power and against everyone else. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Alternet for today's article. With the automated voice of Leibritz R. Thanks for listening.